And I'd like to introduce a moderator for today, and then he will introduce a speaker. So our moderator today is Dr. Erroll Southers, a very good friend of CPD's and a professor at our Sol Price School of Public Policy. And Dr. Southers directs the Safe Community Institute, and know that he is a former FBI special agent who has served on counterterrorism and public safety positions at every level of our government. His work spans many fields, including counterterrorism, homegrown violent extremism, terrorist recruitment and radicalization, critical infrastructure protection, and community resistance to terrorism. He was instrumental in developing the game randomized security system at the International Airport of Los Angeles, and also the system was rolled out across the nation. So Dr. Southers, welcome again to our program, and I'll turn to you to introduce our speaker.
Jay, thank you very much for the gracious introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. I have the honor of sitting today with Todd Helmus. Tom is the Senior Behavioral Scientist at RAND. He specializes in countering violent extremism, CVE, and strategic communications. Todd has authored numerous studies, we've got a few here today, focused on improving the United States' efforts to counter militant recruitment and decrease popular support for terrorism and insurgency, including promoting online voices for countering violent extremism in 2013 and examining ISIS support and opposition networks on Twitter last year in 2016. His studies have addressed radicalization, pathways in Southeast Asia, the United States, CVE or countering violent extremism policy, the role of Arabic language films and books in CVE, and the assessment of CVE programs. Todd is also has experience leading large and complex research efforts. Needless to say, if he's at RAND, that's sort of a given. And so what I'm going to do is hand it over to Todd, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Errol. Let me see. What is the microphone situation? Can I will I be able to hear me on the Facebook Live from here?
Hopefully,
okay.
Probably.
All right, let me know. Because I can move. Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to come here and to be able to give this talk. Thank you, Jay, for the invitation. So I come from the RAND Corporation. For those who might not be familiar, RAND is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution that's actually based here on the West Coast in Santa Monica, California, where I worked for a couple years before moving to the office in Pittsburgh, and now I'm in Washington, D.C. And the nature of the work at RAND is such that you do a lot of different projects. Every year you're doing different projects. Some you don't always get to choose the projects you do, because some places, like, you get a grant and somebody pays for your life and you work full time on whatever it is you want to do. For us, we have to sort of scrounge and pick up clients and do the work that the clients are interested in. And so I've done various different types of research projects, and what I'd like to talk to you now is about something that sort of brings together several different projects, and that is CVE on and offline. And let's make sure I have a stopwatch here so I know what I'm doing. All right. So I want to talk to you about these sort of three items, and I'll try and spend about 20 minutes talking, and we'll hopefully have a lot of time for Q&A. First, the rise and fall of the Islamic State, which I think is a model for how we think about countering violent extremism, though they haven't fallen fully yet. We'll talk about CVE in the public and private sector, and then conclude with some challenges. So I think every good story about ISIS starts with Al-Qaeda and how horrible its propaganda campaign was. Here we see a picture of Zawahiri giving a long, boring lecture, and indeed, 2013, 2014, Al-Qaeda was kind of on the ropes. They were stuck in Pakistan, having trouble putting their head out for fear of getting hit by drone strikes, and trouble bringing in new recruits. At the time, I was worried. I was like, what am I going to work on if Al-Qaeda is really defeated? But then ISIS comes along, and ISIS was, I think, fascinating for a number of reasons, and we'll get to its communication strategy. But they did a very interesting job of declaring themselves a caliphate, and it was really a systematic decision that they made, because there were all these different militant groups in Syria, and they had to outcompete for recruiting militants into their organization. And so you actually go find the document where they sort of articulate their rationale for calling themselves a caliphate, and it worked. And you combine that with their military success, and that, I think a lot of their recruitment success is underpinned by those two features right there. Their military success, their stunning victory in Mosul and other areas like that, and their nature of their being caliphate. But their communication strategy played a fairly big and significant role in this. And obviously we know about their efforts on Twitter. And Twitter was really valuable for ISIS because it gave them a medium on which to be able to launch their communication strategy and reach the public in ways that previously just simply posting videos on YouTube and the predecessor before that, handing out DVDs in the marketplace, could never quite compete with. It gave them broadcast reach. It allowed influencers and their popular support to play a critical role in retweeting content. It gave them connections to recruits that no extremist group had before. Now somebody can pop up their head, express an interest in the extremist group. The extremist group could see that and then target them for recruitment very quickly. Much different than the old way of working in mosques or at least for the radical extremist groups in the Middle East previously had to do. So anyway, it allowed the recruiters to drive connections. So when someone pops up their head, the recruiter can reach out and then take contact offline. It was very successful for them. And their themes are more than just the intimidation. Everyone knows they did a lot of propaganda campaigns of sending choreographed assassination efforts, but they really had a message of brotherly love to bring people in, a message of joining us, the caliphate, doing God's duty. So they really had a variously attuned message strategy that sort of found an audience. But now they've been on the ropes a little bit. They've been losing terrain, but largely because of military operations, and the success of the military strategy against ISIS has a major CVE role. Because it shows the organization is not invincible. It's a losing entity, and people are going to be less interested in being involved in a losing entity. And then the suspensions on social media really helped take them off the airwaves in a major role, which I think hurt their recruitment drives. And so because of that, you see the numbers of people trying to recruit and go into the organization have fallen off fairly significantly. They're not out yet. There's many problems that we can go into on why this organization is still a major fundamental threat to stability to Europe, but it is better than it was 2 years ago. So, and then of course, now we have this burgeoning right-wing threat happening. And I don't have to, everybody is aware of recent events in Charlottesville. This is a major up-and-coming issue. If you've seen some of the data analyses on social media, the number of people espousing hate on social media is rising. And the degree to which some of those groups and organizations can turn violent, like we saw in Charlottesville, that spells a major problem. And even without that, I mean, the right-wing groups were really keeping on, were toe-to-toe with radical Islamist groups in the United States in terms of casualty counts. So, I think that the U.S. government has for a long time not given sufficient credit to the danger that's posed by right-wing and left-wing extremism for that matter. All right. So let's talk about counter-violent extremism now real quick. I don't think I have to go into much detail on what counter-violent extremism is for this audience. But I threw the definition up there because I guess you have to throw a definition up. It's really efforts to prevent people, proactive actions to counter extremists, to recruit, radicalize, and mobilize followers. And I think you can think of two very dichotomous approaches toward preventing violent attacks in the United States. You see on the left here. On the left, you can have counter-violent extremism. Can you prevent people from becoming radicalized, or can you take people who radicalized and turn them back? Or can you arrest, conduct interdiction operations and arrest, and in some cases, especially for international operations, kill them? And especially for the United States, these are very distinct operations. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not have a counter-violent extremism role. When they identify a target, by and large, when they identify a target for investigations, their goal is to conclude that investigation with an arrest. It's not necessarily to have a nice touchy conversation with a guy, trying to make him change his mind. And that's why you see, I think, a real preferred and successful arrest strategy of trying to cycle a violent radicalization process even faster by trying to do undercover operations and get them to push the button on a fake bomb. All right, so various different entities are in charge of doing counter-violent extremism in the United States. We could probably talk for a long time. You can have an entire talk just on these organizations and what they do to counter-violent extremism. Some more, some less. USAID, obviously, they do a lot of programs internationally abroad, and they want to show that their programs reduce potential militants, guerrilla militants. Department of Justice, yeah, the FBI is there, but then also you have, they do various grants and efforts, and they want to train law enforcement officers to at least operate in their communities from a CVE perspective. Department of Treasury does sort of various international work, and the Department of Defense, to the extent that there's military operations, they want to make sure that those military operations are supported by CVE strategies to reduce the militant pool. This was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan and continues to this day. But let me talk a little bit about Homeland Security and State Department. State Department has a lot of really interesting programs. I think the most interesting one is the Global Engagement Center. It's a recently stood up entity. It's sort of a tech startup within Department of State. And it's its forerunner was the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. And Strategic Center for Counterterrorism Operations was not, maybe not as sophisticated as what you're seeing today. They oftentimes they try to directly message ISIS recruits. In our we've done social media work, and we found that they're like trying to call out potential ISIS fighters, trying to convince them to no longer join ISIS or to leave the organization. And oftentimes they're doing this in English. With the the USG logo on their forehead. It ultimately was not very successful, and then they came out with this video called "Welcome to ISIS Land," and that was pretty much the end once that hit the talk show airwaves, and they became a little bit of a laughing stock. So Global Engagement Center came in its place. They're sort of a tech startup. They try to bring in Silicon Valley and Madison Avenue in partnerships, and they kind of have two main strategies. The first has been sort of the bread and butter from the beginning, and that is work with credible voices. They try to find people, and their focus internationally, their goal is to find people, organizations abroad who are interested in countering extremism, and they try to support those organizations in different kind of ways. Sometimes it's supporting them with money and funding their operations. Other times it's building their capacity through training initiatives. They also do a lot in terms of identifying shareable content and disseminating that around. So various different types of initiatives to help these very credible actors, not U.S. government, to message on our behalf. But they don't stop there, because they also do their own message campaign. And interestingly, this has been happening on Facebook. So now Facebook is a real great tool for doing targeted information campaigns, because you can go, if you've ever tinkered with their Facebook advertising app, you should do it, because you can sort of really nail down your target audience in a very detailed way, where they live, what their geographical location is, what was their language, and what are their likes and interests. In this case, they started off by targeting people in Tunisia who are very interested in extremist groups. And so now they can just basically pummel that target audience with messages on Facebook, sort of experimentally developed advertising campaigns to sort of support the broader Credible Voices campaign that's also going on. And that was apparently successful enough that they sort of expanded that to about 9 or 10 or 11 other countries. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is a very different entity. So the way the U.S. does counter-violent extremism abroad and the way they do it in the United States is very different. So there's no messaging program within DHS. There's very limited efforts to do advertising campaigns, do Facebook messaging applications, like that. They really try to work through public-private partnerships as much as possible. For them, the focus is on community engagement, identifying local organizations, building relationships with those organizations. In some cases, it's building relationships just to be able to manage the relationship. We have some organizations that are upset at the U.S. CVE strategy for one reason or another, and you want to build those connections and talk them down from the edge and address their concerns. And in other cases, it's identifying like-minded entities out there who are engaged in counter-violent extremism, who have credibility within their local communities, and then supporting them. And just this year, their approach to supporting them has been to fund them. And so now they've developed, as many of you are probably aware, they've developed a $10 million pool to fund these organizations. And there's been some publicity in the press about how the U.S. government is now going about determining who they're supposed to fund, and we can talk about that. But the Trump administration certainly has a different approach to the partners it's interested in working with, and it's the value it places on counter-violent extremism as an approach than, say, the Obama administration. All right, tech firms have also, of course, played a big role, and I think you're probably all more familiar than this than maybe I am. But one thing we did initial research back in 2016 that looked at ISIS support and opposition networks on Twitter. And so the one thing we were really interested in doing is, one of the things that we did, we looked at the number of people who were tweeting in support of ISIS and were tweeting in opposition to ISIS on a daily basis. And so that's what you see here at the bottom. And so it's interesting because this goes up to probably May of 2015. So what's interesting is you see different upticks like this. So at this point in time, in February of 2015, a lot of people were tweeting in opposition to ISIS, and that was because the Jordanian pilot was killed in the Middle East. ISIS burned him alive. And so that roused a lot of opposition on Arabic Twitter. But then we also see, in the late reporting period, this reduction in number of ISIS supporters tweeting on a regular basis. And this is just at the time frame when Twitter started dismantling accounts that were supportive of ISIS. And this is even before Twitter got really on the ball and really started turning off accounts. But we see a marked decline in the number of people who are able to actively voice their support for ISIS. And this, I think, became even more pronounced over time. I mean, ISIS fighters were having an extraordinarily difficult time establishing accounts and followers to match the rate at which Twitter was suspending their accounts. So that played a big role. Tech companies are also engaged in doing a lot of counter-violent extremism work now, and I think some of you were maybe engaged in this. I know that there's the peer-to-peer competition network that USC was engaged in, along with many other universities and organizations, and this basically is a worldwide competition of university students to develop counter-extremism campaigns, and this is something that's supported by Facebook. Facebook also, as well as other organizations, do a lot to train potential counter-extremist influencers to message against extremism, and they're now developing a consortium with all the different groups, organizations that you see up there. They're developing a new consortium to sort of work at removing photos and other content on hate groups. And I think tech companies are now getting in the game at countering racism online. I think with the Charlottesville events, they've really begun to terminate, not necessarily, certainly some accounts they've been terminating and removing content. And so my opinion is this is a relatively successful approach at limiting the content available to people. All right, so last, let me talk a little bit about community-led organizations. Community organizations play a very big role, and as I mentioned before, it's the linchpin of the U.S. government approach to conducting counter-violent extremism. And RAND recently did some work, doing some survey work with these organizations, and we basically identified like 94 organizations that were online, both right-wing, both counter right-wing and counter Islamic extremism. We did surveys. We reached out to them and talked to about 30% of those organizations, wanting to know like what is it that they're doing, what are their goals and objectives, how are they doing assessment, and those types of things. So with this, we were able to learn a lot about different kind of CVE programs and objectives. We know these organizations do a wide swath of different types of programs and activities, from in-person meetings to a lot of workshops. There's a lot of organizations that do workshops. One of the most common type of effort is to put content online. So different organizations are putting any extremist content online. And we talk to a number of filmmakers. So filmmaking appears to play a major role in these efforts, as I'll talk to in a minute. So in our view, we determined that we can sort of parcel out these organizations in two different ways. One, are they focused on the targeting individuals who are at risk? and preventing them from becoming more radicalized, or reversing their radicalization, or are they working to empower the local community who surrounds this at-risk person, and undertake efforts to train the community to play a CVE role. These are some different types of objectives that organizations use, and the number sort of indicates the number of activities or interventions that seek to target these types of goals and objectives. Everything from countering violent extremism opinions online, helping to enhance social networks of those who are at risk, though to address alienation as a cause, addressing political grievances. So these are sort of the types of objectives that we see that are common for targeting people that are at risk. For targeting the community, you see a lot of different types of efforts. Helping local populations, parents understand risk factors for extremism. Developing initiatives to help local community who identify someone at risk actually conduct an intervention to talk them off the edge, so to speak. Building influential voices to counter violent extremism also appears common, and I'll talk to some of these efforts real quick. So these are just a general sense of how we sort of dichotomize CVE in the U.S. But let me talk through very quickly a couple different organizations. We could be here for days on end if I talk to you about what each and every organization does. So I try to pick a couple examples. Muflihun is a really interesting organization. It's based in D.C. It's a sort of Muslim-led organization. I'm sure you know Humaira, and they make the rounds quite a bit. Just they're great people. So they do an interesting program called Viral Peace, like the State Department Global Engagement Center. They work internationally and in the U.S. to develop people who are interested in messaging against ISIS and making them more influential, conducting not just ISIS but any sort of hate group online. And it really boils down to finding people who are passionate about making a cause against hatred, and then empowering them, training them with social media skills, activism skills, conducting workshops, having them do sort of various events and learn from being a community activist. And then these people come out much stronger community activists, and then they go and in turn influence other people. And then they have like 6 or 7 other sort of program agendas that they have as part of Muflihun. One of which is Off-Ramp. That's basically an initiative to help talk people off the ledge of extremism. Average Muhammad, some of you folks here have met Muhammad. He's just a salt of the earth kind of guy out of Minnesota, Minneapolis. And he does 2 things that I find really interesting. One of these videos, which videos are good, trying to convince his target audience is Islamic extremism. So trying to convince people who might be susceptible to that to realize the errors of their ways. The other approach, I think, which is really interesting, is he does workshops within his local community. He gets these neighborhood kids together and uses that as an opportunity to do a Q&A with them, feeds them lunch, and helps them sort of talk through and ask questions that might be burning on them on these types of issues. Lealina is a film production company. They just do a lot of films looking to counter violent extremism. A film looking at empowerment of Yemeni girls, 3 girls in Yemen who go out and develop their own business. A film called Broken Dreams, which is essentially about folks who've been radicalized in Pakistan and in Los Angeles gangs, and that process of bringing them back from the brink. And then Unity Productions takes a different approach. Their goal is to help the broader population understand that Islam isn't so bad. And they do these really interesting films that talk about bridging the gap between religions, that try to expose Americans who probably have a very narrow and soda straw view of Islam, to help them have a much broader sense of that religion, and to develop respect and appreciation for it, which in turn has a CVE role given the potential for alienation among Muslim populations. And then finally, counter-racism. There's a lot of counter-racism programs, uses a lot of workshops to try and sort of talk to people about their sort of ingrained opinions about race, and try to address people, take a more holistic viewpoint of racism or of counter-racism. I'll skip this. So several challenges that are worth highlighting, and I'll just mention these really quick and we can talk through them as part of the discussion. But online extremism is now going into private communication networks like Telegram, so it's much harder to target. In my view, it's safer than if it were publicly exposed, like on Twitter. But still, it's a thorny problem. Overall, these CPD programs, I think, are all fascinating. I have no dog in the fight as far as which one is better, partly because there's been so limited evaluation on these efforts. And that's why we came up with this report here, trying to help local counter-violent extremism programs develop their own assessment mechanisms. We're going to be doing workshops with different organizations. We have video coming out on this effort. But lack of evaluation is a real fundamental issue that needs to be addressed, especially if these organizations are to maintain their government funding. Many Muslim populations are concerned that CVE is just another word for targeting Muslims. And to the extent to which counter-violent extremism is just another catchphrase for addressing Islamic extremism, then they may have a point. And so there's a lot of political challenges in doing CVE in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're targets of U.S. government engagement. Government-supported community programs, as I mentioned before, U.S. government has just recently started to think about, hey, let's start funding these organizations. But the way the government is deciding how they're going to fund these organizations is having some issues. Some counter-white supremacy groups have lost their funding because they weren't fitting with the political issues of the day. So that's a real issue. And some organizations don't even want federal government funding because they see it as a pariah to have that on their backs. And then domestic extremism, just the degree to which the government is probably not putting enough attention on that very important topic. So that's it. I had some concluding observations, but I think that will suffice for now, and I'm happy to open this up to a dialogue with Erroll and everybody else.
Okay, Todd, thank you. Todd, you did an extraordinary job of framing that. So before we do open it up, I want to at least shape this a little bit differently, in some instances more broader, and a little bit, actually in some instances a little more constrained. And so as Todd mentioned, the Islamic State has certainly distinguished themselves as a pioneer in the use of social media and recruiting. Unfortunately, we're dealing with adversaries that are learning organizations. As we talk about the Islamic State, those of you who don't know, I'm at the State Communities Institute here on campus. We did a foreign fighter study in Minneapolis 2 years ago. It is the recruitment capital of America for the Islamic State. We happened to be there the last time 4 young men were arrested and were prosecuted last year for trying to leave. I sat in that trial, and so you understand the challenges here. We have two issues. Number one, yes, online does play a role. However, what we found in our study is that on-the-ground, peer-to-peer, face-to-face recruitment always precedes the online enhancement. The challenges about that online enhancement is that they all talked about, when I sat in the trial, Anwar al-Awlaki, who's an American-born cleric who's born in New Mexico, killed in a drone strike years later, but that he was like a rock star to them. And I say that because it's something that we need to be aware of in terms of how that recruitment effort and strategy starts. There are other groups now that are closing the gap on online extremism, and let me just shape this for you. If we look at Twitter now, which is was ISIS's preferred social platform, and I can tell you when I sat in that trial last year, it was like a encrypted apps 101 tutorial with regards to how he explained to the judge how he did. And just so you understand how complex this issue is, the emir of that group, the leader of that group of 4 guys that was going to leave 2 years ago, his uncle is the director of a counter-violent extremism program in Minneapolis. And so that's what we're dealing with. Right now, today, we have white nationalists that have grown by 600% in the last 2 years. They're now outperforming ISIS in every social metric online, both in Twitter follower counts and tweets per day. And so this is a very complex problem when we talk about online radicalization. We have a new partnership, and Todd alluded to it, the Online Civil Courage Initiative, OCCI, in the UK, which is headed up by Sasha Havlicek, who is the CEO for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook. In just the last year, they've launched in Germany, In just a few months, they've already engaged and trained over 100 NGOs and reached more than 4.3 million people. Terrorism and violent extremism is both personal and local. And I was happy to see you feature Average Muhammad. When I go to Minneapolis, I practically stay at Muhammad Ahmed's house. He's a superstar there. I sit on his board for his company, which is now funded by Google. And we know it's working because we're getting cyber attacked by ISIS every single day. And so it works. However, we have a challenge here. What do we do with people when we talk about at-risk communities? We're running into hybrids. We have extremists and terrorists now that are using their extremist checklist and checking off what works for them. How do you approach a person or know he's at risk, like Tamerlan Tsarnaev, one of the Boston Marathon bombers, who was not only an Islamic extremist, but was a neo-Nazi Holocaust denier? And so those are things we have to talk about as we go forward. I'm going to say the one thing we have to do is understand that these, as Todd alluded to, these communities that are deemed at risk, let's not make the mistakes that our allies have made overseas with regards to predetermining who's at risk. I can tell you when I go to Minneapolis, one thing I was told when I first got there 3 years ago, we're tired of being laboratory experiments and the subject of reports, and no one's really asking us what our needs are and what we do. 100% of the people I've talked to in Minneapolis, when we go there to talk about violent extremism, tell us that gang violence is their #1 issue when it comes to public safety. What's really interesting and a challenging research question is that of all the young men that I know that are now incarcerated in Minneapolis who wanted to leave to join the Islamic State, none of them were ever gang members. So you've got to ask yourself, why is this happening to sociable, academic, stable families, usually employed, and very successful young men that decide one day they want to buy a ticket to Turkey? So this is a very complex problem, and we don't have the answers. What I do want to share with you, though, is that as we move forward, it's got to be something that the community owns. And they have to decide what their priorities are, reach consensus on that, and how they're going to devote the resources to address it, or else we won't be able to move forward. So I'm going to open it up to questions there. We've got about 25 minutes or so left. Mike, thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
And I'll just open it up to anyone who has any questions, and we'll try to do our best to respond to them. Yes, sir.
Do you mind standing up so we can all hear you? Thank you.
I'm a security strategist from Turkey, but I am a immigrant here. Especially after the last election in the US, Mr. Trump said lots of things about the immigration policy. Maybe some of you don't support or some of you support, I don't know. I didn't vote because I haven't voted right. But really your immigration policy, you should some change for the Islamic countries. I did some states in New York, in Ohio, my last year, and I saw lots of some Muslim people also. Actually, I'm not. Your immigration policy, when accepted people, country, as a tourist or long-term stay, I don't know, FBI or the immigration authorities, they're looking the channel, internet, Facebook, the activity. I wonder this because Rand Corporation and you speak about the internet and Twitter and Facebook. When you accept a person this country for touristic aid or another things, some authorities, they looking for their Twitter account or Facebook account for quick questions.
So the question is on U.S. immigration policy and recently initiated ban on Muslim refugees and others from entering the country, or not a ban, a restrictive policy. Is that sort of the and also efforts from the authorities to review social media of people coming in. So my take, I knew this question would come. My take on the administration's policy toward immigration is that I'm not sure how it necessarily addresses the threat as we know it There's not been very many people coming in, very few. I think there's been only 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 arrests of individuals who have entered the country from outside that would have been covered by this ban. And so, at least from recent arrests, from attacks and arrests in the United States in the last 10, 12 years, it would have done very little to limit that threat. In terms of like looking at social media of people coming in, I think there's value in that.
I didn't ask the immigration policy. I didn't ask the immigration policy. I just say that because of the election, this came up this issue. I'm asking that did you any authority in the U.S., FBI or Homeland Security, they are checking some people coming to this country.
Their social media accounts.
Yes,
Got
that's
it.
the question.
Got it.
I'm not saying anything.
I mean, I've not studied this issue. It seems to have there's some prudent value, I think, in reviewing social media accounts, possibly of people coming in. And the only concern I have is it's pretty easy to thwart that. If I have a Twitter account that's not at Helmus, which it is, but if it was something other than my name, hiding that would not be very difficult. Deleting that app from my phone. So the question is, do you want the government to engage in more intrusive policies, such as evaluating all the content on your cell phone, which might be effective, but might also have some, I see some heads nodding, might have some freedom implications as well.
So let me just add that since 9/11, we've had 750,000 refugees settle in this country. No one's been arrested for terrorism or for violent extremism of those 750,000 people. I can tell you also that in France, they are now actually doing what you're suggesting. In France now, we don't have the FBI cell phone debacle that we have here. If there is an attack, they have access to that phone immediately. They have access to those encrypted apps immediately. And last year I met with the prosecutors in Paris, and they actually now have sentenced the first citizen of the country of France to prison for visiting jihadi websites. So they've swung much further over with regards to civil liberties and privacy in this issue than certainly we have.
Do we have any social media questions?
Oh,
go
yes.
ahead.
I actually, so you did mention countering terrorism on the left, and I was really curious because there was a focus on countering terrorism on the right. And so I'm curious, and this is a very niche question, so I understand if you don't have the answer to it, but when the new government, the new administration of the State Department decided to roll back funding for counter-right terrorist groups, did they then offer more funding to groups that were countering terrorism on the left, just out of curiosity because of affiliation?
Let me speak to part of it. I'm personally attached to that. I know Christian Vigilini and Angela King and Arnold Michaelis very well, and we were actually part of their original proposal. But I'm talking about a group called Life After Hate. They're an international organization of former neo-Nazis who we work with very closely here at USC. They were originally awarded, and then in January we were all notified that they were going to reevaluate the awards, and then they were subsequently told that they were not going to be funded. I can only tell you this, that the $400,000 that Life After Hate would have gotten would have significantly bolstered their efforts. Christian has told me that they have received 10 times as many calls for assistance and resources since January 20th than they have in the past. And so there has been an effect. The other thing I want to state here without sounding like a commercial, Christian Picciolini and Angela King will be here on November 14th. We're holding a global summit on homegrown violent extremism, and they will be here to speak to that. But it has had an impact, and I don't know that that money or funding has gone to any organizations that are going to address countering on the right, as you suggested.
You asked about countering on the left. I used to do drug abuse research, which is very closely tied in the animal research community. And so when I think of left-wing extremism, I think of like counter animal research attacks groups, which there are many. And if you do laboratory research at an academic institution, they're very much on your mind because they do conduct attacks. I have no idea what the government does to counter that threat.
I guess I just had groups like, I'm teaching a class right now, and a big subject has been Antifa, and so that's the group that I had in mind. And I know there are like diverse opinions on that group, but
They're so new.
Yeah, so very, very new.
But I do consider them, but they are a threat, and I do consider them, sure, government would be interested in doing something, but right now I think they're just so new on the scene.
They're very much on the grid for DHS. The Intelligence and Analysis Unit sent out I can say this now because it's not sensitive, law enforcement sensitive. On August 9th, they sent out a law enforcement sensitive document warning about what was going to be the resultant clash in Charlottesville. They knew Antifa was going to be there. They knew that the white nationalists were going to be there. This was a planned event. The violence was planned, and unfortunately things went awry. So they are being looked at. They are being monitored. I've gone to their site, and they've even said that they are doing the same things that people on the right are doing. They're arming themselves, they're training, and they're going to be an issue.
Is there a situation? I thought there was one earlier. Yeah. I'd like to ask a question if you haven't addressed it. Perhaps you can point me in a way or something that you may or may not know about is susceptibility of impressions about joining these groups, which don't necessarily come from perhaps historical violence, maybe gang affiliation or what have that. There's a tremendous amount of neurocognitive and mental illness that exists today for young people. And I was just wondering if you know any research or any findings or anything that's being discussed of trying to figure out motivations and impulses in an impulsive society, seeking solace in these affiliations, and perhaps that is a way in rather than other more conventional antisocial behaviors.
Stacey, that's a great question. We're working with a hospital in Lyon, France, and their conservative estimate of a very significant number of what they believe are radicalized individuals is that 30% are suffering from mental illness. So we are now going to be working with them to look at what's the pathway there for that happening, and then what might be the therapeutic response to what is in place. But it's a very high percentage. I don't know how they arrived at that empirical formulation, but that's what they're saying. So if that's true, what we're trying to do here now, obviously in the United States, is be very holistic with regards to our response to this and include the mental health community, the public health community, as we go forward with the counterterrorism effort.
One thing to consider when you're looking at that is different states are either patient rights states or family rights states, and because of the right structure and a history of abuse of people with disabilities, institutionalizations, makes caring for those so challenging. So.
Yeah, my take on the whole, like, why do people join question is there's just a ton of different studies, and all the studies show different things. So it's just such a heterogeneous problem. I mean, you're talking about joining Antifa, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, animal rights groups, and the notion that there's like some psychological characteristic that makes people vulnerable to all those different things, it's just really hard to pin down. I used to do that research, I find, but it's lost its sort of satisfaction because it's very hard to pin it down. And it's an important question for CVE because, in theory, if you know what causes people to be at risk for violent extremism, you can relatively very easy develop programs to address it. If it's just mental health, for example, or if mental health is a big proportion of it, well, geez, now we just got to take all these 18-year-old kids and make sure there's no mental health problems, right? At least you know it's a hard task, but you know what's before you. We don't know. And so you have like 1,000 different programs out there doing 1,000 different things, and which I think is fine because the empirical knowledge on what they ought to be doing is just lacking, I think.
Great,
So that's I'm a little bit more jarred on that.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Justin Rashid. I'm a security advisor for UNICEF. I'm actually based in Yemen, so the reference up there. My question is about the media, the mainstream media. What role, if any, do you see the mainstream media playing, for example, magnifying social media efforts by ISIS and allowing that to sort of last longer than it should and allow audiences to pick it up that might not receive it directly from social media? And do any CVE strategies look at the mainstream media to counter that effect?
Well, I mean, I think mainstream media was fawning over ISIS's a communication campaign that's very sexy and interesting and makes for good stories. So I'm sure that enhanced the audience a little bit to the extent that it needed to. It's hard to say what role there is, at least here in the United States. The programming I'm exposed to doesn't appear to have a real radicalization content. I'm not aware of content in other countries to know.
No, I don't mean about the content, but I mean just the coverage of, like you say, with the Jordanian pilot, when that video came out, mainstream media here, CNN for example, described it as Hollywood. They were lauding the production quality of the campaign, like you say.
If that's an example, that was not a hit for ISIS. That hurt them probably more than helped them. It really galvanized the anti-ISIS community as that being an example. But I hear what you're saying in terms of the mainstream media's role. I don't know. What do you have to say?
So, Justin, it's a very good question, and I'm coming from the annual conference of National Association of Black Journalists last month in New Orleans, and it was a journalist question, which was, how should we cover this? And so one of the things they're doing, much like law enforcement and counterterrorism agencies, they're being very cautious about labeling it something that's not before they hear it from the authorities. They're also trying to add some parity with regards to Islamic issue or Islamic-driven attacks and non. But they were very concerned about how they should be covering it. At the same time, they run into the issue of ratings, and they don't want to be second. And so it's a push-pull for them with regards to when do you announce it's a terrorist attack, when do you announce who did it, and how quickly can you get away with that. But they do ask that question quite often. When I'm in front of journalists, it's the first question they'll ask is, what are we doing wrong? And so they are cognizant of it. They don't want to give them any more credibility than they deserve, but they don't want to miss out and not be able to push that story out there if that's the truth. That's a good question, very good question.
I have a quick question about the community-led programs that you were speaking of. So it seems like some of them you were saying were based in the United States, but I was just wondering if the production companies are mainly targeting people in the United States or people abroad, because obviously those are two very different populations of potential people who radicalize.
Yes, I think Unity Productions. I think they have international audiences. Lena definitely tries to disseminate their content in multiple regions. They see various Arab countries and Arab television networks as sort of a key demographic for them, and that fits with some of their funding sources as well. I think Unity Productions, which seeks to address Islamophobia, I think they're definitely interested in addressing Islamophobia as it occurs in the United States, but they're more than happy for other people abroad to watch them.
So you mentioned in some of the CPD programs about addressing political grievances. I was wondering how those take shape. Are there cooperation between local government or national government and the organizations that are coming up with these strategies? What would a typical example of something like this be?
Yeah. The question's about what programs that seek to address political grievances. What are those like? So a lot of different programs have various different interventions that they do, and within each intervention, they have multiple objectives that they try to reach. So a workshop conducted with a local population of kids might seek to, address their views, might seek to address their ideology, might seek to help build connections across the participants, so addressing social alienation, and some of them might seek to address, as you say, political grievances. And my view is there's very few programs out there that focus solely on the political grievance issue. Most of that is embedded into the architecture of other different types of programs. So it's not like a hard-hitting thing like a program that does web video shorts to change ideology. I mean, that's really easy to grasp and it's catchy. The counter grievance ones are a little bit different, and some of them have a little bit of a right-wing flair to them in terms of their approach to things. So,
Cody, that's a great question, and the challenge is, in terms of metrics, is when do we know it's working? We're heading back to Minneapolis next month to do a one-year study to look at that population of young people that are exposed to the same messaging as these individuals who've tried to leave, to better determine why they are not receptive to it. And that's an interesting story. You're not hearing about, what I tell the media they can cover is you're not hearing about the programs out there that are doing great work. Everybody knows Average Muhammad, but they don't know the West Bank Athletic Club. They don't know the African Reconciliation Development Organization. These are organizations that are community-based in Minneapolis, doing great work every single day, but you only hear about the person that wants to buy the ticket to Turkey. So there are groups that are working and doing great work. We're trying to see, can we measure, what is it about this population of young people that's decided, that doesn't attract me at all, and I'm living right next door to the people who want to leave. So we're going to try to get better at that, but we don't. But to Todd's point, it's not addressing the political issue so much as it's really looking at it more holistically.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role that culture plays in CPD.
Role of culture in CVE. I only have a.
It's a huge question. I have to sort of figure out in what respect.
Well, certainly CVE messaging directed domestically would be different from CVE messaging directed at Tunisia or at some other place in the world. And so how does that factor into how scholars and others prepare for such a eventuality?
I have a couple thoughts on that. One, the beauty of the U.S.'s sort of local community approach is that culture is embedded in the program, right? You have, to use a Minneapolis example, you have people from Minneapolis doing engagements with people in Minneapolis. The culture is right there. They don't have to fine-tune anything. And so having a local approach means that culture is always baked in. Internationally, I know, for example, that the Global Engagement Center, when they do their Facebook campaigns, they do, real sort of advertising A/B campaigns in their messaging. So they develop multiple advertisements, advertisement models, and then when they conduct their campaign in, say, Tunisia, they're exposing different audiences to advertisement A, different audiences to advertisement B. They then measure the response to that advertisement, do surveys with those populations, see what people like what, and now they fine-tune. Now the next iteration of the campaign is then retargeted based on that analytic data.
Developed with Tunisia in mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why I imagine that the advertisements shown to people in Tunisia are fundamentally different than the advertisements shown to other countries as well.
In the United States, it's even more nuanced. Because you have one ethnic or national origin of the population you're dealing with, they're very different. I spend time, I'm using Somali because those are my friends and that's one with. The Somali American community in Minneapolis is very different than the one in Columbus, Ohio. It's very different than the one in City Heights, San Diego. And so because what we may work in Minneapolis, it doesn't mean it's going to work in Columbus, Ohio. And so it has to be as, for lack of another term, tailor-made and built by that community for it to be effective. And so it's really the culture of that area that it's in that's going to work.
Here's a question from our consultant.
Oh, sorry.
I just had a question. You talked a lot about preventative measures. I'm from Minneapolis, so I'm familiar with the West Bank. But are there a lot of procedures or methods in place to rehabilitate the people who were converted into extremism and put them back in the community? I don't know what they're doing
So last year we had our fingers crossed. Judge Davis was the presiding judge in that case, and as you know, he was working with Daniel Kohler, who was in Berlin. We had hoped for our first American deradicalization program. Unfortunately, when Daniel came here and did his assessment of those four young men, they were deemed to be not eligible for the program. So we're still at the starting blocks as that goes. And what we were planning to do in Minneapolis was to take Daniel's program, which has been fairly successful. It's called Exit Germany. It's in Berlin, and it deals with right-wing extremists there. We were going to apply that to those individuals who are Islamic extremists here. It's a family approach, and we were going to launch it through the probation department in Minneapolis, and unfortunately, when Judge Davis deemed them ineligible for the program, we're not at the starting point. But we're hoping someday to be able to start that somewhere in the United States, and I'm sure Daniel Kohler will be very much a part of that effort.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
I I came in late, so I didn't follow from the beginning, but from what I saw from your presentation, I'm happy to see that all the efforts are geared towards dealing with the root, cause of the problem, and dealing with the cultural side of it, because, we saw many solutions that were focusing on the security, side of the problem, and it doesn't really work that way. It might, of course, it is necessary, but it's not the sole or an only way to address the problem. I have just an observation. It might not be a question. You always refer to Islamic State, Islamic this, and Islamic that. I am a Muslim myself, and I can tell you it has nothing Islamic in it. And the way, it might be, you might think it's a shallow observation, but I really know that it really alienates so many people, Muslim people, that do not believe in this. The majority, actually, of Muslims do not believe in this, and they don't affiliate themselves with this at all. And the only reference to Islam and Islamic and Muslim as, and portraying them in that area and cornering them in that is not, it does not frustrate me, okay? It's not frustrating. I'm talking about a more, a deeper problem for the young generations, because they feel excluded, and exclusion is bad, because here starts a very big problem. They might be, prone to radicalization. They might be prone to anything bad. So, they vulnerable. So, and I know many examples of Muslim young boys and girls who have been, exposed to comments or to acts of, exclusion and racism, and it really hits them. It really, influences them badly. So I'm concerned. I'm the Consul General of Egypt in Los Angeles and all the Western states, and I am worried about my community. I'm really worried, because I would love to see those programs, which I think they are very, very well designed, and they address the real problem. I would like to see them more sensitive to, or have sensitive cultural side. Thank you.
No, I absolutely agree, and that's why the programs we're working with, they weren't built by anybody other than the people who live there. I absolutely agree. As a quick aside, there was nothing more touching to me than my second or third trip to Minneapolis to listen to a young man say to me, every time I go to the airport, they single me out to talk to me. I said, well, why is that a problem? He says, because I work at the airport. That speaks to the heart of this whole problem. And so you're absolutely right. And so that is why I agree with you. It's got to be built by the people that are going to be affected by it and need to own it.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. And that's something, we've done work something that comes up a lot, this concern that say the U.S. has over-securitized its relationship with the Muslim community. And so that's a real issue. One approach addressing sort of the Islamic State moniker is that it's wise not to call them the Islamic State, because that just gives them credence for being the caliphate or the state that they think they are. And so terms like Daesh and IS and ISIL have been the preferred moniker for the counter movement for some time. So thank you for recognizing that. Yes.
I'd like to question the common use of statistics from the past to project into the future. And I believe that the United States has been very lucky with our immigration over decades and many generations. For the most part, you can find very little that's gone wrong, and people have, after one generation, typically flourished. And that's not directed towards any one particular group of immigrants. It's an overall umbrella that almost all groups have done well after a generation. But using past, we're in a rapid moving world with quick changes, and using even the statistics of a few decades ago to project into the future, I don't see as particularly useful. So people leave their nations in a particular era. So let's say the Iranians who left post-Shah, they grew up, most of the ones who arrived here thrived. They were semi-secular. They were fleeing the incoming republic with all they imagined could happen to them. Lebanese who arrived several generations ago were leaving a different situation than they are now. Chileans were leaving, three decades ago, a different situation than people are fleeing from now. And they arrived with a different set of expectations, and they taught their kids to expect different things. And we are, a lot of us, immigrants or children of immigrants. Even the ones where no finger is being pointed, the people that are Chinese in the room could readily admit that the people that arrived to build the railroads are different people who are arriving now. The people who are arriving from India are different people who were arriving several generations ago, and mainly in a positive way. They flourished. But people were fleeing different things, and they were educated in different ways. So using statistics to say that somebody from the same country was educated to hate the United States, which is presently occurring and did not occur before, they will arrive with a different mindset.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this question is basically about the immigration policy. We can say that, if I get your question, we can say that, well, we've been relatively safe from immigrants in the past. Is that going to hold up in the future? And you're right, we don't necessarily know. And if that were your sole rubric, everyone would apply to the policy, then that would be one thing. I think what's key, though, is the things that you'd want to consider in changing the policy would be what intelligence you have on adversary and enemy operations. Are they trying to infiltrate via one particular route or another? And if they are, then maybe policies can be addressed to address that route. To my knowledge, I'm not aware of any such intelligence that exists. We know that if we look at ISIS, for example, there are folks returning from ISIS that could potentially cause problems in host countries. So the U.S. wants to know who those people are and wants to prevent them from entering in the United States. I think that's a little different than establishing a wholesale policy that has a number of potential negative side effects that could enhance the risk of radicalization in other sectors. So,
thank you for your comment. And Todd, I agree with Todd. I would add, so people have a frame of reference here, when I'm talking about people that I know personally that have gone through the vetting system, come to America, it's been a 7 to 8 year minimum process. So this is not a quick process. And that could speak to the success we've had with regards to the people that have come here, and we've not had any issues.
So one last question.
Oh.
We'll take it out with a student question.
Yes, I am a student. I just got here actually 2 weeks ago. I'm currently a captain in the Air Force, so 2 years ago I was actually, many of my flights have been over Syria. The first year that we were fighting ISIS, so just been, this question really is for you, Todd, at RAND, and I don't know if you guys know what the policy, what they plan on doing. I spent a lot of time out there, probably 400 combat hours out there, and so I'm wondering, and I've been following it ever since, and now I'm at grad school, so now I have a chance to do the research on it. I'm wondering what is going to be the policy with the Peshmerga, the YPG, the Kurds that we are working with, and they are the forefront right now on CVE operationally and militarily. What are we going to do with them now that we are finishing out Raqqa? We potentially could finish out this Daesh really soon. What are we going to do with them now? Because now we are in a really hothead situation with Turkey Syria, and we have supported nonstop since 14 the Kurds in this fight.
Geopolitics in Syria. I do CVE for various reasons. That's probably one of them. First, thank you for your role in combating counterviolent extremism. I do believe one of my comments was I do believe military operations against ISIS have played a very significant CVE role in limiting support for that organization. So thank you for your service. The Peshmerga issue is a big issue because they played a significant role in fighting alongside Iraqi soldiers, and U.S. has been supporting them for some time. They've really been at the forefront of combat operations against ISIS, and they may want some freedoms in the future that Turkey would be opposed to. I mean, it's just I don't really have an answer to that. Just to say that region is just an incredible sort of boiling point of different competing interests, none of which pan out. No policy in that region is going to make everybody happy, and so I look forward to hearing what Erroll's recommendations for solving that problem. But it's a really thorny issue, and I'm not sure how the U.S. deals with it. And there's a lot of fundamental issues that U.S. has to engage with Turkey on in regards to resolving the Syria issue, and none of them are easy.
No, I would just have to unfortunately say I just totally agree. But most importantly, thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you.
This is a very complex issue, and it's not going to get any easier going forward. It's very dynamic, as you know, having been there. And so we just have to, based on intel, see how we move forward.
All right. Well, thank you also very much. Thank you, Erroll. Thank you, Todd.